Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back with the 50th episode of our favorite 100 movies of all time. We are at the halfway point. I never thought we'd get here, John. I'm going to be completely honest with you. We started this thing, I think it was a year ago last week. We took a couple weeks off here and there, but it was a year ago last week. Big stuff for those who have hung around since the beginning. Thank you. We've actually kept up some pretty decent numbers. I know, John, for a period there, I think at the beginning, I was like, if we get 10, 15 people, we won't keep doing it. I think we've had over 200 views on nearly all of these 50 episodes. Some of them have gone plus 400, and that's just from YouTube. On our what do you call it? On our audio boom, actually, the numbers have been quite good as well. So appreciate all of you keeping us on your weekly radar there. It's been fun for both of us. And I wanted to say this right off the top so that we can kind of get this word out there to anybody who's going to be listening. But once they announce the Oscar nominees for Best Picture, John and I are going to hop over to the Survivor Specialist Patreon group, and we are going to give a one episode thing for each of the movies nominated for Best Picture, kind of do a deep dive on each of them, probably about a half hour, I would think, on each movie. So each one, if there's 8 nominees, we'll do 8 episodes. If there's 10 nominees, we'll do 10 episodes. So that's something that really to look forward to once these nominations come out. Saw the PGA came out the other day. I was very happy to see Licorice Pizza get on there. That made me very, very excited. I have a lot of work to do come Oscar season. I've been very lazy with keeping up with movies from 2021. It's because I've just been watching old stuff. Wanted to get that all out of the way. Tonight, we are talking about 2 of the greatest villains in the history of cinema, and I am not exaggerating. We have Hannibal Lecter. We have Alex DeLarge. Somehow, some way, this is John's first experience watching A Clockwork Orange. I had both of these movies in my top 100. I had The Silence of the Lambs a little bit lower down, but it's good to see that we're finally getting to it. And A Clockwork Orange comes in here right at number 51, right in the bottom half of my top 100. John, what rock did you crawl out from under this week in order to watch this film?
When it comes to A Clockwork Orange, it's always been one of those movies that I've just been meaning to get around to. Obviously, it's Kubrick, and I love Kubrick, and it's Burgess, and I love Burgess, but I just never got around to watching it for some bizarre reason. It's just one of those things where by the time I had gotten to an age where I didn't have other people telling me what movies to watch anymore, I just kind of forgot about it for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we started this a year ago, I saw it was there, and it's like, this is probably one of those ones I have to wait until we actually talk about it to see it for the first time.
Yeah, and I'm very happy that you waited because this movie is such an experience. This was rated X when it came out, coming actually on the heels of Midnight Cowboy, which came out, I think, 2 years prior to this, wins Best Picture and was also rated X at the time of being released. So Hollywood was really just throwing around X ratings for really no reason. This movie definitely deserves it more than Midnight Cowboy, which literally was rated X specifically because a man receives a fellatio, we'll use the proper terminology on this, from a minor in a movie theater. That movie was rated X for that. I'm really shocked by that. This movie, I kind of understand where the X rating comes in because of how pornographic a lot of the imagery in this movie is. We're going to talk about The Silence of the Lambs second, even though I think Clockwork Orange is probably the more popular of these 2 movies. They're both very massive. Clockwork Orange just has the Kubrick attachment and all that. Mm-hmm. But since John's never seen it, we might as well just get this out of the way now. Clockwork Orange, I think when I did my original list back in 2010, fresh out of high school, just getting into college, I think A Clockwork Orange ended up in my top 20 somewhere, top 25. It was just one of those movies. I ended up moving it down as I started to see more movies. And I actually started to, if you look at a lot of the movies that are in my top 50, they start to become a little bit more romantic. A Single Man, which we'll be talking about next week, Shakespeare in Love, Adaptation, which I guess you wouldn't call a romance, but Breaking Away, Before Sunset, Ordinary People, Wall-E. These are movies that when I was 18, I wasn't going to sit there and say, this is in my top 100, let alone my top 25. So as time's gone on, Clockwork has just kind of worked its way backwards. But this movie holds up so incredibly well through the test of time, despite how graphic it is, despite how violent it is, despite how stylized it is, despite the dialogue that is used. All of this, it holds up incredibly 51 years later. That's the most mind-blowing part. This movie is 51 years old. And John, I know you watched another movie this week from the same year. This came out the same year as The Last Picture Show and The French Connection. The French Connection ultimately ended up taking home Best Picture that year. As are clear by my top 100, Last Picture Show and Clockwork Orange, in my opinion, are much better than The French Connection. But it's funny to see kind of the mood of 1971 in America. Very bleak, very, very bleak, because the one thing those three movies have in common is that they are very depressing and very negative towards people in any type of authority position.
Yeah, absolutely. And A Clockwork Orange is so interesting because it's based off of this novel that's really it gained a lot of popularity because of the Kubrick adaptation of it. And the Anthony Burgess isn't, as is tradition with Kubrick adaptations, Anthony Burgess not a big fan of this movie because he feels it kind of misses some of the point of the book. And that's kind of how I felt about it too, where it has this anti-authoritarian message to it, but it never really doubles down on it. And it kind of just glosses over it to focus more on the hyper violence of the situation.
I disagree. I think that this is a great study on authority being anti-authority, authority trying to overpower your life. And one of the most disturbing scenes to me in this entire movie is after the entire night out, then we see him at home with his parents. And Mom, I don't feel well today, reminding you he's a high school aged person. And I think that with this movie, it is, yes, it's getting into all the violence and stuff at the beginning, but that is to offset the ridiculousness of the scenarios that go on after and how he starts feeling sick over every little thing. And the authority, I kind of almost liken this to, it's just like the doctor's always thinking that they can do more than they really can. We're going to completely change this psychopath. You're never going to completely change the psychopath. You might partially change him, but all it's going to take is one little thing, and it's not going to change him anymore. And I think that the look at the authority figure from the police officer in this movie, how Dim and his other guy, whose name I can't remember, they move up into the ranks of police, just kind of showing that nobody in this society really belongs where they belong. They're all kind of fraudulent. And if you want to make the argument, Alex DeLarge is really the most sincere, authentic person in this entire world. And I think that's what creates such a negative dystopian feel for this movie.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, especially because the character of Alex DeLarge is portrayed very well in this film. Malcolm McDowell's performance is absolutely incredible. But it's also just the way that the character's built in it, where we're first introduced to him in this hyper-violent situation where, it shows in the milk bar where there's all the pornographic images, goes to them beating the man up under the bridge and doing the home assault. And then it goes back to them in the milk bar. And just that contrast of this hyper-violence we're seeing to Alex's appreciation of Beethoven. It's something we're going to talk about later when we're talking about Lecter too, but it's that humanization of a villain where all of a sudden this appreciation for art brings this villain down from this despicable, hyper-violent person to someone who's much easier to relate with. And it's a beautiful technique in character building that this film does incredibly well.
Yeah, and I think Kubrick's obsession with classical music, Kubrick was the originator, in my opinion, of music that is the opposite of what's actually occurring on screen. We see it in Dr. Strangelove with what's her name's song, Vera Lynn's song, We'll Meet Again, Don't Know Where, Don't Know When, as the explosions are going off. We see it in Space Odyssey with all the classical music that's going on throughout that one. That fits a little bit more. Eyes Wide Shut, it is loaded with that. He's going through this deep, seedy underbelly, and it's despicable, but he's going through that entire thing. The Shining, we have some great moments in The Shining with all that. And this gave way for David Lynch does a lot of this with Yoriando and Candy Colored Clown and all of that. But I love the use of this music because what we're saying about Alex in this movie, and I think the statement at large is, he's actually brilliant. And that's what makes him so damn terrifying. because he knows what he's doing is wrong, but it's how he gets his kicks. He can't help it, but he's actually incredibly intelligent when compared to everybody else around him. When you have an intelligent criminal, that is so much more terrifying than a dumb criminal. It's kind of like, if you think about it, this was around the time, and I might be wrong, but this is around the time of Ted Bundy, right? Like Ted Bundy, what were the years on Ted Bundy? He was around this. Let me just look real quick. Yeah, in the 70s, Ted Bundy. So he was after this movie, but we start to see that that fear of this really good-looking, charismatic guy who is incredibly violent. And I think what I like about this movie too is it's not afraid to just blatantly tell you it's this cycle. It's the rising action, the falling action. He runs into the same people over and over again. The people he screwed on the way up, or the people who are screwing him on the way down. I love that it's really doing all that and leaning into it. I think that just adds that element of like lesson, but because it's being told by Kubrick, it doesn't feel like we're being taught a lesson. It feels like instead we're just watching the rise and fall of this absolute psychopath.
Yeah, and even then, like building off this idea of a lesson, it doesn't feel like a lesson because it feels like everything that happens to Alex after his rehabilitation isn't deserved. And while we watched him commit these crimes earlier on to deserve these actions, it's kind of this critique of the American view on rehabilitation versus incarceration. And the fact that because Alex had previously done these things, is he ever redeemable? And that's the question that's really being asked in the second half of this movie, is like, Alex is a completely different person. He's physically unable to commit harm at this point. And he's been punished. He's received retribution for it. How then should he be treated by society?
And I think what's funny is this movie's 51 years old. 51 years old. We go through this pretty much weekly right now in our society, with people coming out as, going and all of these different accusations that were coming up during the Me Too movement and things like that. It always gets me when you watch a football pregame show and Michael Vick is on it. Michael Vick, who is famous, obviously, for being the quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons and the Philadelphia Eagles, but also running a dogfighting ring. And he's on that. And he had this all happen to him before the cancel culture really started to take over. And we're not going to be forgiving at all. And I think it's interesting. It's an interesting depiction that 51 years later, we're still asking the same questions of what can we forgive, which we'll get to when we actually talk about Magnolia, which that is one of the more famous lines from that movie. What can we forgive? But this movie is not giving you the easy answer for that. But it is a great point that you bring up. We watch Alex rape, murder, and just beat the living shit out of people for no reason. He's an absolute thug. He's a horrible person. He's an absolute piece of shit. And yet we watch him go through it and we say, well, he's changed. So if he's changed, why aren't we going to be more forgiving? But the people who were harmed by him, their lives are completely altered forever. So of course they're not going to be forgiving of him. But how do you determine what makes it okay for you to go back into society? And we see Alex doing everything that he can. And I think what's fascinating about this movie is it still leaves you with almost the same way that I feel nowadays with a lot of this stuff. Once somebody's canceled, I'm using canceled as the term, but you understand where I'm coming from with this. Once somebody's canceled and then they go, they serve their time and they come back, they are not welcomed back. They're not welcomed back. And we've seen that a lot. There's a couple people like Louis C.K. goes and does a stand-up show. People like his diehards are welcome back, but society as a whole, every article that you're reading about Louis C.K. is about, I can't believe he's back. Fuck this guy. All of those wonderful, wonderful things. But if he did his time, what does that mean? And if you keep pushing them, are they going to go back to what they were that they were trying to be rehabilitated from, which is exactly what happens to Alex DeLarge in this movie. And I think that's why this movie is absolutely one of the most brilliant movies ever made. And we were talking about Parasite, I think last week, but it's been a little bit. Parasite is a timeless classic already, and it was made in 2019. This is another timeless classic. The reason that this movie still resonates with people and still disturbs people to the point where they won't watch it, but it's still considered a classic, is because the rise and fall of Alex DeLarge is one of the most fascinating arcs in the history of cinema for this type of character. It really is. It's second to none. Malcolm McDowell, as you said earlier, is absolutely perfect in it, but it is offering these questions about society that are so relevant still and are going to be relevant hundreds of years from now and were relevant hundreds of years ago. What can you actually forgive, and can people really be rehabilitated? And if we don't allow them to be rehabilitated, are we actually damaging society more? Because would Alex DeLarge have been better had the people he'd hurt on the way up actually forgiven him when they ran into him now that he's been cured? Air quotes.
I mean, that's the big question, right? And that is a lot of the big themes that's being proposed in this film, is this idea of, first off, we have the whole idea of the rehabilitation in the first place. It's brainwashing. It's about as dystopian as we can get when it comes to this type of thing. Is it real rehabilitation then if it's not an actual learned behavior, but a forced behavior? And then that, of course, at the end, when Alex is once again cured, as he put it, means that it wasn't effective. But you also have to look at this brainwashing that's happening. It seems fine because it seems like it's just, getting rid of the violent tendencies of him. And then they play the ninth.
Yeah.
And at that point, you realize, oh, this is actually torture. Because we see the doctor going into Alex's room in the prison, seeing the Beethoven on the wall. So we know that he knows that this is an important piece of music for Alex. And the fact that he intentionally puts it in here means that society is still, when they say they're trying to help you, are just going to throw you down and ruin you as much as possible so that you can better fit their ideal.
And like, watching the man that he abused and killed the wife of, or whatever, he doesn't kill the wife, but she goes and, kills herself later. Watching him get his revenge, and he's not even satisfied.
Yeah.
That reaction, and Kubrick had such a thing with faces. I have a Kubrick book here. I don't know where it is, but Kubrick had such a thing with just faces. And, you always think, here's Johnny is iconic. Alex DeLarge staring into the camera at the Morocco Milk Bar. Like, all of these different things. Like, he was so good with that. And that one shot of the guy like gripping his legs in the wheelchair and just staring up, it's horrifying. But he doesn't feel satisfied with this, because it's just anger begetting anger. That's all it is. It's the hatred. It's wanting to make this man suffer. And that's what this whole thing is. After Alex makes everybody suffer at his time, now everybody wants to make him suffer. And you can't argue it for a lot of these people, but also, like, where do you go from that? How do you go from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the huge question that this movie is really putting forward is rehabilitation possible if society isn't willing to accept rehabilitation? Because Alex is put into this experimental program. The government's hyping it up. They're saying this is revolutionary. It's going to help solve all the world's problems. But society's not ready for it and not accepting of it. And because of that, it doesn't work. Alex reverts back to his violent self at the end of the movie. And arguably would be even more violent, because now he understands that this is really what gives him life, is acting like this and being this criminal, because he had it removed from him and was tortured because of it.
Yeah. And I didn't touch on this before because I totally forgot you had said it after I went on my little tangent, but you're right about the whole, like, are you actually rehabilitated if it's planted in you? If it needs to be forced, are you changing? Is he actually a different person, or is he just the same thing he always was? And he's just still the same exact fucking monster that he was. And I keep cursing during this one, but Clockwork Orange just gives you that vibe of, like, you must curse because it's just such a disgusting movie. But like, when he's throwing up and the girl's standing in front of him and doing the dance and he's trying to grab her, and oh no, he's throwing up and whatever. what is he actually changed, or has he just been brainwashed? Has he just been corrupted in some sort of way where all it's going to take is one thing, Ludwig van and jumping out the window, and now he's back to who he was because he was able to inflict violence on himself to bring him back to his violent ways. He wasn't changed, he wasn't rehabilitated. No. But I think we see this a lot. We see these forced fake apologies. This, I apologize, I'm going to step away, and then they come back a month later and everybody's like, oh, well, they apologized. Or these, somebody will say something that's not even offensive, and then everybody jumps down their throat on social media, so they come out with some bullshit apology that nobody cares about. That person has not changed. That person is no different. The mob, or whatever you want to call it, not the mob, but it's the vocal people on social media. They're the ones who are now satisfied with that. That person's no different than they were 10 minutes ago, 10 years ago, whatever it was. And I think that's what this movie is expressing. Imagine Alex DeLarge in the world of social media. It's frightening. It's terrifying, but it's also something that's very easy to understand and think about.
Yeah, because we see it every single day. Every single day we have something like this happening where somebody is pretending to rehabilitate, and then they just fade off into obscurity for a little while. Like you said, like, Alex doesn't change in this movie. And while, like, they try to pose it in a way where it seems like this brainwashing in the end will work even if it wears off, the problem is like, you're not changing the core of a human being. And while rehabilitation is possible, it's only possible through remorse. And Alex doesn't feel remorse. He doesn't feel anything like that for any of the crimes he committed.
No, he still wants to go and do his own things. He just feels something in his, his gully or his gutty works or something, whatever he calls it. He just feels a sickness inside of him that's preventing him from doing it, but he still wants to do it. I think that's what's interesting about the way that this is told. Every bad thing that's coming at him, he still wants to take part in. He still wants to grab the naked woman. He still wants to be a part of the violence. He's just averse to it at this point, which, lets you know as this is going on, like, he's not going to be better by the end of this.
No, not at all. And it is framed beautifully. And, like, we've spent this entire time so far just talking about Alex's character and the presentation of him. But we also have to look at how Kubrick frames Alex throughout this entire movie, because there's points in the film where it really shows the detail Kubrick's putting into this. I love the contrast in the opening title sequence of just like the solid color background to the contrast of this incredibly pornographic milk bar. It's a beautiful contrast. And we get these we all know Kubrick loves his centered shots with the long looks down hallways and everything. But even as we were progressing through that opening sequence, and they confront Billy Boy and his Droog, and it's just staged like a play. Like, Kubrick is just so particular with every single movement that's happening on screen that, despite how repulsive some of the imagery is that we're watching, it's just so beautiful at the same time.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how, like, there's so much genitalia in this movie. There's so many graphic moments. I think about what Malcolm McDowell had to go through for this movie. We'll talk about, but the amount of there's literally zero holding back in this movie. Kubrick could get away with it a little bit because he had started to become kind of like a cult hero by this point. Space Odyssey was very popular with the young kids, so let's bring it back. And now we're going to make this movie. But yeah, the visuals in this movie, the way everything is set up, where it's futuristic, yet it still feels like it's happening relatively present. It's a sick feeling. It's a very sick feeling. And I agree with you. And then at the end, when, and the contrast of this classical music to all the violent acts that are happening. What's the song that's playing when they're having the threesome? And it's just, that had to have filmed for 40 minutes, but it takes, he does that like 45 times speed, and it takes about a minute. But it's the Beethoven something. I forget what it's playing, but it's the whatever that is. It's doing that, like, to contrast all of these graphic things with this beautiful music. That's Kubrick's decision. Like, yeah, I understand that in the book, it might be written that he loves this, but to be able to pull that off and still make it so terrifying, and you know, them sitting in the car driving really fast and all the other cars having to skirt around them and all that, like they're clearly in front of a screen, but these visuals are just, they're incredible.
Yeah, they are. And the thing that really, the setting of the film, and like you said, where it's set in the future, but it feels like so present at the same time. I think the record store scene really punctuates this, because everything we've seen before that kind of seems a little off. It's like we don't have milk bars and stuff like that. But there's a record store with familiar albums prominently on display. Right?
Space Odyssey's right there.
Space Odyssey's right there. And I'm like, wow, subtle, Kubrick.
Yeah.
But of course, you also have Sgt. Pepper's is up there, and it's noticeable. And like, that's the moment where you're like, this is taking place in our world. It's like, this isn't like some far off dystopian future. This is like tomorrow.
Yeah.
And like that again leads into that the terror that this film has, where it's like, it's not just talking about like this hyper violent tendencies of humankind and how it does give them joy, or it's not just talking about like this hypothetical authoritarian government that's running everything in the future. This is talking about the here and now.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that it's like, yes, is it a bit of an exaggeration of government control? Yes. But how much of an exaggeration is it really?
It's not super exaggerated. It's a fascinating look. And I want to talk about Malcolm McDowell here, this performance that he went through. The scene where they are drowning him, he had a straw that he was supposed to blow out of or something when he actually was starting to get hard of breath. It broke and he literally almost drowned at that scene. The scene where he is sitting in that chair with his arms in the straitjacket and they're keeping his eyes open. He literally was in the straitjacket. Like, he could not stop that from happening. This is such an unbelievably difficult physical performance. And he just is on it. I mean, the fake vomiting while he's got his eyes open, he has to watch whatever's happening. And, you know, they're playing Ludwig van and all of that. This is such a physical performance. He wasn't nominated for the Oscar. Probably the second most glaring omission in the history of time, other than Ryan Gosling's for Blue Valentine, which I always go back to. But those two not being nominated is insane. This performance is so physical. And I know Gene Hackman ends up winning for The French Connection. They're not close. They're really not. No. Popeye Doyle is a cool character. Popeye Doyle is nothing compared to Alex DeLarge. That's just a fact. That's just a fact. And I think it was Gene Hackman who won. I got to make sure that's actually true before I start spewing this. But I like his it's so physical. And you know, that just makes it I think all the more impressive. And I just think it's so entertaining. And yeah, Gene Hackman did win that year. And yeah, there's no nomination for Malcolm McDowell.
Yeah, it's pretty wild that Malcolm McDowell doesn't get nominated for this. It is a phenomenal performance. It's a performance that simultaneously makes you feel so much fear, but so much sympathy at the same time. It's really impressive what he's able to pull off in this film.
Yeah. Now, did you have you seen most of the other Kubricks? This is the first Kubrick we're actually talking about on this podcast. So I just wanted to see, like, every other Kubrick. Have you seen all the other big ones, or are there any that you haven't seen? I have them all in front of me. So
I've seen all of them. I've never seen Spartacus. It's his older works that I really haven't seen.
So like Lolita, Killer's Kiss, Spartacus, Fear and Desire.
Yeah.
Did you see The Killing?
No.
You haven't seen The Killing or Passive Glory. So pretty much anything from the 50s that isn't Dr. Strangelove. Yeah. Well, Dr. Strangelove wasn't the 50s anyway. Dr. Strangelove was 64. So, okay. So I just want to say this. The first time we're talking about Kubrick. I haven't seen Barry Lyndon in about 10 years. The reality is, once I rewatch Barry Lyndon, which we're going to be doing for this podcast, that's going to be in my top 100.
Yeah.
I haven't watched Full Metal Jacket in about 10 years. The reality is, once I rewatch Full Metal Jacket, that's going to be in my top 100. I haven't rewatched Paths of Glory in about 10 years. It's probably going to be my top. Eyes Wide Shut, haven't watched it in 10 years, but that's how good Kubrick is. I have this as my fourth favorite Kubrick, behind The Shining, 2001, and Dr. Strangelove. Yeah. I could realistically put 8 Kubrick movies in my top 100, and The Killing would be very close. that's how much I love this guy, and that's how talented I think this guy is. And it's almost like I might be putting Clockwork Orange too low on my list because I'm trying to compensate for the fact that I can't have 5 Kubrick movies in my top 20. But this is the first one we're talking about, and it's all the way at number 51. Like I said, I haven't revisited Barry Lyndon, Full Metal Jacket, Paths of Glory, Eyes Wide Shut in a while. Lolita, I didn't really care for. Killer's Kiss, Spartacus, Fear and Desire. I really hated Spartacus, I will say. I think that's a very boring movie. But all of his other movies are just fantastic and could end up in this list at one time or another, depending on the kind of mood I'm in. So, A Clockwork Orange, the first one we're talking about, but we are going to be watching 4 more of them because we will be talking Barry Lyndon, Shining, Space Odyssey, Strangelove. I wish I could have fit Full Metal Jacket in, but John doesn't watch enough war movies to really make me force that one in. Yeah, it's your fault.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, and it's actually you who's throwing Barry Lyndon in.
It is.
I
am.
I knew it was being thrown in over The Shining, but I couldn't remember which one of us was doing it.
Yeah.
Because I have The Descent for some. Oh, no. I was wrong. It's my movie. You are the one. Yeah, you're Barry Lyndon with Dr. Strangelove. I'm The Descent with The Shining. Okay. But that's for another day. And those are both the same episode, so that'll be fun. Anything else you want to say about Clockwork Orange, though, the first time you've actually sat down and watched this movie?
I think the language used in the movie is really important. You kind of mentioned it earlier, where it's like it's this weird, like Cockney half-breed language that is a little hard to follow at first, but I think it's so necessary to have this kind of like almost nonsensical language being spoken in contrast to the hyper-violence and the pornography of the film.
I agree. And the language doesn't matter. It's the visuals that matter.
Exactly.
The language doesn't matter. And it's kind of like a 1984 thing going on with that, where it's like the words that are being said don't need to mean anything.
Yeah.
The government has made them mean nothing. Milk isn't even milk. Yep. You know, and what is it? It's loaded with zip or something like it's just nonsense. But that's fine because it's not about that.
Exactly.
All right. Best movie you watched this week. It was kind of a long week. I think I only fit 4 movies in, but what was the best thing you watched this week?
I actually also didn't watch as many. I mean, I watched like 10 movies in the last week, but not that many.
I'm not even close to being at my pace from last year. Not even close.
Like you said, I watched The French Connection today for the first time. That movie wasn't as good as people made it out to be. It's still a fine movie, but
it's a good movie, but it's not.
It's a good movie, but there's like 90% chase scenes.
Yeah.
It
was such like guerrilla filmmaking, though. That's what really set it apart. Was
exactly,
the filmmaking style of Freaking.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the chase scene where Gene Hackman's just driving around the city. Yeah, I mean, it's impressive, but it didn't quite do it for me. I finally got around to The Tragedy of Macbeth, which is from Joel Coen directed it. One of the Coen brothers. The other one's retired. With Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand, and that film was incredible and like everything I want from a Shakespeare adaptation. I love Shakespeare. We're going to be talking about a Macbeth adaptation in a few weeks here with Throne of Blood. So it was nice to have an English adaptation of Macbeth, which I thought was also very strong. But if we're going for the best movie I watched this week, I finally sat down and watched Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. And A Few Dollars More is by far the best movie in that trilogy.
See, I've never actually seen. I only watched. What do you call it? What are the 3?
The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
That's the only one I've watched. Thank you. Sorry, I was just totally drawing a blank on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That's
like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a great film. It's an iconic film. I understand why it's iconic. It's like half an hour longer than it needs to be, in my opinion.
For sure.
Whereas for A Few Dollars More, it feels more concise. The chemistry between Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef's character is just fantastic in that one, where you don't really get that kind of like character connection in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where we have it for A Few Dollars More. And I just thought it was a phenomenal film.
Yeah, I love The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. I haven't seen the other 2. I have 2 this week, so I watched I think 4 movies this week. 2 of them, though, really stood out. I finally rewatched Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, a silent movie from 1927. It didn't win Best Picture, won Best like artistic whatever. That and Wings were both. I think they're both great movies. Sunrise is phenomenal. Sunrise is a brilliant movie. It's silent. It's like an hour and 45 minutes. Like, it takes its time. But if you've never seen it, you got to check it out. It's about a guy who lives on a farm with his wife, and he decides that he's going to murder his wife to run away with a city girl. And as he goes to murder the wife, it goes wrong, and now he and his wife are stuck together in the city after he just tried to murder her. It is brilliant. The visuals in the movie are breathtaking, like legitimately breathtaking. I have no idea how they pulled it off. And I was say, because I just watched All Quiet on the Western Front today, another movie that has some really phenomenal moments, but just didn't connect with me. But Sunrise 3 years earlier with no sound, nothing. I don't know how they did it. It's absolutely mind blowing. That was a rewatch though. The best movie I watched for the first time was The Insider. Finally got around to watching The Insider with Al Pacino and Russell Crowe and pretty much everybody else who's ever existed in the history of film who's a character actor. They're all in it. Stephen Tobolowsky's in it. What do you call it? Michael Gambon's in it. Christopher Plummer's in it. Like, it is a loaded cast, and that is such a great movie. I had no idea what it was about coming into it. I thought like The Insider, Michael Mann's directing it. It's probably something similar to Heat. It is not. It's about a man trying to take down the tobacco industry. A movie about the making of a 60-minute segment should never be as entertaining as The Insider is. The Insider is flat out fantastic. Russell Crowe, there's a reason Russell Crowe was such a hit early on. I mean, 97, he's in LA Confidential. 99, he's doing this. 2000, he's doing Gladiator. 2001, he's doing A Beautiful Mind, which is a movie I personally despise. But still, the fact that he was able to do those all within the beginning parts of his career, the man was insane. And it's a great look at the media and how corporations can just try to ruin a person's life just because they have money. Brilliant movie. Loved every second of it. Michael Mann, probably one of the more underrated directors in Hollywood, just because I feel like people never really discuss him as somebody all that often. But between Heat and Collateral, Last of the Mohicans, The Insider, even Ali, like that's a pretty solid lineup of movies for somebody. So definitely check that one out if you ever get a chance. Couldn't recommend it enough. All right, John.
All right.
Let's talk about the movie we both have on our top 100 list. You have it at number 51, so it's technically your movie. Let's talk about The Silence of the Lambs, one of the only, I think, 4 films in the history of film to win director, picture, actor, and actress all in the same year.
And rightfully so. I mean, this is a film that this film, up until last year, was Anthony Hopkins' best performance.
Yep.
But we can't say that anymore because The Father exists, and that might be the best performance ever by a single actor. But The Silence of the Lamb is a phenomenal performance from Anthony Hopkins. Jodie Foster is also incredible as a kind of this like bushy-tailed, eager FBI cadet, but is also like striving as this strong female protagonist that it just like for such a mainstream movie and a horror film to have this much mainstream appeal and award appeal, it's phenomenal. It came out the same year I was born, so obviously like I have that connection to it. And what Lecter represents is just so powerful. And now, granted, I am one of those people who will say that as fantastic as Anthony Hopkins' performance as Lecter is in this film, I don't think it's the best portrayal of Lecter, because I think that came in Bryan Singer's, like the NBC Hannibal from Mads Mikkelsen's performance. But the introduction of Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs just created one of the most iconic villains of all time. And it not to mention that there is a second iconic villain in this film.
Okay. So I got a couple things to say about this. We were talking about Parasite. It was last week, right? Like we were literally talking about Parasite last week. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about Parasite. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about Parasite. I was saying it's probably one of the most universally loved movies by by critics, fans, whatever. This is the original of that. Like this movie is 30 years old now, 30 plus years old. Because it actually came out in 91, John. So it's actually older than you.
No, I was born at the tail end of 91. Nice try, Phil.
Oh, that's right.
I beat you by a week, remember?
That's right. Okay, but anyway, I'm looking up just stuff right now. AFI top 100 movies, they put it at number 74. The IMDb top 250, it's rated number 21. If you go on Letterboxd right now, it has a 4.3 out of 5. This movie's 31 years old. My parents talk about this movie all the time. They went and saw this on a date, not even a date because they were married by this point, but they went and saw this right after they got married, right before I was born. Like, they love this movie. They talk about this all the time. I love this movie. You love this movie. This movie defies logic. It is I don't even consider this a horror movie. I know everybody does, but it's not a horror movie in my estimation. It's a mystery. It's a thriller. It's disgusting. But I don't find it to be a horror movie. I just find it to be a really frightening thriller. Like, there's a different thing. Like, but this movie should not be as palatable for everybody. It's about a guy who eats people and a guy who kills women and skins them. Yep. And yet everybody loves this movie. And Hannibal Lecter, Clary Starling, Buffalo Bill, all three of them are iconic. When you have two of the most iconic villains in film history in your movie, you know you did something right. Ted Levine not getting an Oscar nomination for this is up there with Malcolm McDowell and Ryan Gosling. Let's just put it that way. Him not getting an Oscar nomination for this is bizarre. I don't understand what they were looking for. The fact, especially that the movie was so critically acclaimed, how do you not give it to that man? What was he doing in this movie? He is terrifying in this movie. But to have both of them in the same movie and then at the same time have one of the greatest heroes of all time and not have this be a good versus evil movie. This isn't a Star Wars easy to define heroes and villains. This is a murderer helping an FBI agent capture a murderer. It's just brilliant. And I have to say, the direction by Jonathan Demme, who is a one-hit wonder. I don't care what anybody says. Jonathan Demme is a one-hit wonder. The direction by him and his decision to break the fourth wall about 50 times in this movie is brilliant. How that doesn't get old and how it actually works, I will never completely understand, but it just elevates this movie. It is such a distinct style, and this movie is just full of iconic moment after iconic moment after iconic moment after iconic moment. It's just mind-blowing. Every time I watch it, I'm just like, is it going to be as good as I remember? Is it? And it always is. It always is. It's just an incredibly powerful movie. It's another one that's just going to stand the test of time. This is going to be one where I'm going to sit down. I'm going to make my kids watch this when they're 6 years old. I'm kidding, so the internet can't cancel me. But I'm going to make my kids watch this, once they're teenagers or whenever the hell I want them to watch it. And what's funny is then I'm going to say, this is your grandpa and grandma's one of their favorite movies too. And they're going to go, why? Like, aren't they old? Like, why would they like this? But that's how powerful this movie is. Wins Best Picture despite being released in February. Unheard of. Just a brilliant movie. Just brilliant. And it's a shame Jonathan Demme could just never put it all together again because he just couldn't.
I mean, he was also handed this perfect situation to make this perfect movie too, right? Like, you have two phenomenal actors in your leads. You have a phenomenal actor in your secondary role as well. And you have this fantastic story that is so... You're talking about how you don't really classify it as a horror movie. And I think that's part of what makes The Silence of the Lambs such a good film, is that it kind of straddles that thriller horror genre very well, which is why it's palatable to those people who aren't usually accustomed to as graphic films as this. But it's also, despite the fact that it doesn't have as much graphic material as some other horror movies at the time, it still appeals to the horror junkies as well because they love the character. And that's really what it comes down to, is this character of Hannibal Lecter is arguably the most terrifying character of all time. The presentation of this very sophisticated man who, as we meet him, we know already going into meeting this character what he's done. We know he is a cannibal. We know he eats people, and has no.
We know he's a psychologist.
Yeah, we know he's a psychologist. He gets into your mind, and every little aspect of the performance from Anthony Hopkins just makes you seem like this is someone you can trust. And then we get that third act twist where all of a sudden he's murdering the two guards, who dons the one guy's face to escape. It's such a contrast And that's what's so scary about him, is because he seems so normal. That's why Lecter is such a good villain, because he seems to care. He seems to have this genuine connection with Clarice and just wanting to nurture her and help her find Buffalo Bill. But really, he's just so driven by his own motives to the point where he can talk someone into killing themselves.
Yeah.
Where he can murder someone, don their face to go and eat someone else.
And steal a jet and get the hell out of the country.
Yeah, it's fascinating that this character can even exist in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is the character that's also just so acclaimed by everyone.
And guess what? Like, we root for him. We're actually kind of rooting for him to get what he wants because he does build it up. And it kind of goes back to the, the whole thing with Lost when John Locke is talking to Charlie in season 1 about, I could help the moth out right now, but it would never be strong enough to survive. Mm-hmm. That's what Anthony Hopkins is doing to Clarice this entire movie. This entire movie, the monster is so symbolic, but of so many different things. And the obvious one is Buffalo Bill going through his transition. But it's also of Clarice having to grow and get the strength. And Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter will help her, but Hannibal Lecter is still making her work for it. Sending her to all these different places, and she's figuring out she's as smart as him. And there's a respect that's built there. And that's why at the end he calls her just to let her know, I'm still out here. I'm still out here, and I'm going to go have an old friend for dinner, which is one of the best ending lines like ever.
Oh yeah.
It's classic, but just they do both build up a respect for each other. And just as the audience is building up almost a love for this Hannibal Lecter character, like we're starting to really like him. He's going to help her catch the guy who's the real bad guy. Mm-hmm. He gets out of his cell and we see what a monster he really is. And the last time we actually see him is when he rips the face off and he's sitting there and he hits the guy. And then we don't see him again until the very end of the movie. He's not in the whole third act of this movie. He's not in the whole third act, but he's still alive. And it's just his presence. It's knowing that Hannibal Lecter exists in this world that makes him so terrifying. And he wins lead actor despite being in 14 minutes of this movie, 15 minutes of the movie. It's one of the shortest best actor or actress wins in the history of film because his presence is always there. And because when he is on screen, he is everything. Like he is everything in that movie. So, it's one of the all-time greats. And I will say that while The Father is definitely Hopkins' best performance, this is one of the top 5, I really believe, most iconic characters in film. I mean, you have like Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo. Those are 3 from the same movie. That's also for like Star Wars fanatics, Indiana Jones. But for somebody who's not like in an action-adventure type movie, this might be the most iconic character from a not action-adventure, family-ish film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the timing of this film was really important as well. I think this film kind of ushering in the 90s was a big thing for it, because our horror movie villains for the last decade had all been these faceless slashers. And Hannibal Lecter's the complete opposite of that, where someone like Jason Voorhees or Freddy, they're all disfigured and they have these faces that make them stand out. It shows that they're a monster. I mean, it's a trope that was used for far too long and still gets used today about like the disformed villain. And having Silence of the Lambs come out off the heels of that, and having Anthony Hopkins just look normal and act normal for the most part, it makes him above all those other villains, because those other villains, you can kind of end the film and be like, okay, well, those don't exist. But you leave Silence of the Lambs thinking, is there someone like this out there? And do I already know them?
Yeah. Well, and it kind of set in motion. I mean, we see this now throughout the rest of the 90s. And we're going to be talking about 7 next week, which is, I think, on your list. But it was on my list as well. It was just higher up on my list. But 7 is the same thing. It's a guy who's too smart for the cops. And the villains who are smart are the scariest ones. And we just said that with Alex DeLarge. And we see this a lot in the 90s of movies just constantly trying to top the Silence of the Lambs. I will say, Seven, in terms of gory and disgust and all that, does top The Silence of the Lambs. Seven is one of the most disgusting movies ever made, ever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not doing it just for the shock value that a lot of movies try to do it for, like a Hostel or something like that.
Yeah.
But we see this constant, like, the 90s were a very dark era. And I find that to be interesting because the 80s have their own distinct style, the 70s have their own distinct style, but the 70s was like a anti-government, anti-politics type thing, anti-war that was still trying to give a little bit of hope to it. The 90s, in an era where people were, in America especially, were actually doing pretty well. People don't really complain about the post-Reagan Clinton era all that much in America. They really don't.
Mm-hmm.
They might not like one of those two presidents, but they don't really complain about how life was during that 90s time. However, the movies that were coming out during that time are incredibly dark and negative. And now when you watch back, the best movies from that era really are these overly violent, despicable movies. Why is that? I don't know. But The Silence of the Lambs really set the tone for that. And not for nothing, a year before this, I guess a year after this was Unforgiven, but a year before this was Goodfellas.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a lot of very Goodfellas, into Silence of the Lambs, into Unforgiven, a lot of just very, very violent, in your face with gore and blood and antagonists that are classic movies coming out in this era during a time where the mood wasn't nearly as negative as it certainly is now.
No, it's really interesting when you compare the fact of like what was happening in the world to when these movies were coming out. Because I mean, especially in like an American standpoint, where you have the fall of the Soviet Union and Americans kind of rejoicing about that, right? They won the war again. They won the Cold War, but we still have all of these film projects coming out that are dark. They're gritty. They're taking like the noir style of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they're making it even darker. And they're going as black as possible to kind of be like, okay, so everything looks really good, but what's happening underneath the surface?
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating era in film history, and it's given us some fantastic films.
It has, and it's fun to talk about, these types of movies. And another character in this movie who doesn't really get their due is Frederick Chilton. The one who Anthony Hopkins decides he's going to eat at the end of the movie. But his performance, this Anthony Heald character, his performance, brilliant. It's just so good. Him staring into the camera while he's asking Clarice on the date and everything, and she just turns down. He's like, all right, well, anyway, just go do. He's such a skeevy character, but he plays it just so well. With all of that though, you have Hannibal, you have Chilton, you have Clarice, you have Buffalo Bill. It's just like, it's all there. And what I think is very interesting about this movie is the fact that it is a female protagonist film.
Mm-hmm.
That goes under noticed a lot of the time by people when they talk about this movie, that it is a female driven film, because people kind of give a lot, like they always talk about Hannibal Lecter, even though everybody agrees that Jodie Foster in this movie is unbelievable. But this is Clarice Starling's movie. Clarice Starling and the things she has to go through as she's going through this kind of like, West Virginia and backwoods Virginia and all that, these places where everybody's looking down at her like she doesn't fit in, she doesn't belong, anything like that. The one thing I hate about this movie, and I really hate it, I really, really hate it, is that they have another female cop. It pisses me off to no end. And they focus on her at the scene where they're in the elevator and the blood's dripping down. If she's not in this movie, this is actually a perfect movie. That's the one thing about this movie that doesn't work, because there's so much attention drawn to the fact that Clarice is a female, that she doesn't get the respect from her male counterparts, and yet she's better than all of them. And to have another female character, all of a sudden it's not as crazy that she's the only female there. I'm fine with her partner, who they're always going back and forth and talking about. But I hate that they have that other female cop, because it drops it a little bit of like, Clarice is this new thing. But I love how she's able to be the one who's figuring everything out. She's the one who finds the moth cocoon in the throat. She's the one who ultimately finds Buffalo Bill while everybody else is going the wrong way. Like, I love that this is driven by her and what she learns from a mastermind to catch a mastermind. It's it just works.
Yeah, it does. And Clary Starling's character is kind of pushed aside a lot when we talk about this film because, like you said, a lot of people just talk about Lecter. But one of the big things with Clarice in this is she's they make it very clear she is literally the only person Lecter talks to.
Yeah, the only one.
Like, not a single person. Like, Chilton's not able to get this much information out of Lecter. The only person who Lecter is willing to talk to is Clarice. And it goes back to what you were saying about like this matching of wits that they have, where they have a similar intellect, and because of that, is so important. And that is one of the most beautiful things about this character relationship is that while Lecter had like the power shift between the two characters is very palpable. You can see it. You can see when Clarice holds the power. You can see when Lecter holds the power. But they're evenly matched, which is why that can go back and forth. And that's so important because this movie this movie isn't as good if Anthony Hopkins just steals the show from Jodie Foster.
Yeah. No, Jodie Foster needed to be able to go toe-to-toe with him. Needed to be able to, and she does. And she wasn't massive at this time. Like, she had been in Taxi Driver, and she does a great job in Taxi Driver. There's no denying that. But it's not like people were looking at Jodie Foster in 1991 going, oh, man, how did they ever land her? If you look at some of the other movies, I mean, I know she was in The Accused, and I think she might have been nominated for the Oscar for The Accused. Did she win the Oscar? Oh, so she did. Never mind. I'm totally full of shit. She won the Oscar for The Accused. But still, while that's, you win Best Actress for a movie that, have you seen it? I haven't seen it. It's not one that's really talked about all the time. That was the only thing she'd really been in up to this point other than Taxi Driver. And so, yeah, she's coming off an Oscar win, but it's like, okay, how good is she really going to be, going toe-to-toe with Anthony Hopkins playing a serial killer? She kills it. She nails it on all accounts with this performance. And it's kind of funny because after this, she really never gets back to there again. Like, Jodie Foster doesn't have that next performance that makes us go, wow, she really like had it the whole time. I thought that was very interesting.
Oh, definitely. I mean, my introduction to Jodie Foster was Contact, so it was one of the films I did follow this. And like, you watch that film now, and it's just amazing the difference in the performance between the two. Like, yes, her performance in Contact is still good, but it's nowhere near to the level that her performance in Silence of the Lambs is. Yeah,
and this movie really, I think, disturbed her, wrecked her a little bit. So that doesn't help either. I mean, she was in a very long engagement, which we talked about earlier. And I mean, she was an Inside Man, but these weren't movies where it was like, wow, give her the Oscar again. So back to back, not back to back, but 2 years apart, whatever it was, she wins Oscars and for Best Lead Actress, and here she is. I mean, Clarice Starling go down as probably one of the most iconic female characters in film history. We didn't talk about Scott Glenn at all yet, John.
No, we haven't.
He has a smaller role in this, but if you watch like the director's cut or the outtakes or anything like that, he was supposed to have a much bigger role than he ultimately ended up having. Another person that we didn't talk about yet, but another one to just add to this list of, phenomenal performances in this movie. Scott Glenn with a very like subdued, but also a respectful performance in the same way as Hannibal, except his is in a more, teacher, more what you're used to seeing from a teacher. And I think the contrast between him and Hannibal, despite the fact that they're both kind of doing the same things for her, is interesting to see. It's also funny how he even knows the only one he's going to talk to is you. He won't talk to any of the men. We keep trying to send the men in and he won't talk to any of them, but maybe he'll talk to you. Even Scott Glenn is kind of using her as bait to try to just get what he ultimately needs.
But even on top of that, I think the contrast between Scott Glenn's character and Lecter is also important because of the interest they both have in Clarice. Because you're never really convinced that Scott Glenn's interest in Clarice doesn't have a nefarious aspect to it. Whereas with Lecter, you can tell it's genuine respect is the reason why he's willing to speak with Clarice.
Which is funny because you would think it would be the opposite, right? It should be the
Yeah.
opposite. The person who's her boss should be more respectful and all that, and we should be more concerned about Hannibal. There's not one time where you actually think Hannibal's going to do something to Clarice for some reason. You never feel that he's actually going to harm her in this movie.
Yeah, and that phone call at the end of the film is to show that. Yes, Hannibal escapes, and everyone else is saying that, everyone else tells Clarice she has to be worried about it because Hannibal's escaped. And Clarice is just like, I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
but she still has that look on her face of, oh shit, at the end of the movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, she still knows there's a massive serial killer on the loose. That's not good.
Yes. But that's why we have the sequel.
Yeah, which she didn't want to do because she was so disturbed by how this one went. And that's why they ultimately end up getting Julianne Moore for it. And Hannibal's actually not bad. Hannibal and Red Dragon really aren't bad movies. They're nowhere near this, but they're not bad movies. Actually, Red Dragon has a couple incredibly disturbing moments. The one with Gary Oldman and the other one with the guy on fire going down the wheelchair. I won't say who that is, but that scene is crazy. But yeah, the Gary Oldman part, woof. They're both pretty good. The end of Hannibal is pretty disturbing. Not gonna lie, the brain scene, but yeah, neither one of them hold a candle to this one.
No, but the Hannibal series does.
Well, yeah, I actually haven't watched the Hannibal series, but that's
die on that hill.
Yeah, no, and I think most people would agree with you, John. I don't think you're going to get much pushback from people saying that movie or that series isn't good. I know Nick Antosca did a hell of a job with that, as far as I hear, and crazy that's on NBC, right? Of all things, like how the hell does that happen?
Yeah,
we live in a weird time, man.
We do. One of the other things that we really haven't talked about with Silence of the Lambs, though, is the way characters are portrayed in this film, and I think it's really interesting that aside from Clarice, every other character is kind of built up prior to us meeting them and like understanding them. And one of the big things is Lecter really humanizes Buffalo Bill a lot, but never to the point where you are sympathetic for Buffalo Bill, which I think is fascinating from a Lecter standpoint, where he's this character that we are sympathetic towards, that we are rooting for, and the way that he knows the psyche of everyone, that he can manipulate things. It kind of goes back to what you were talking about with the way that like the fourth wall gets broken. It's because the fourth wall gets broken in a way in this film that is not like a side to the audience. It's as if it's like
where Clarice
specifically as the audience, you individually are being spoken to. And it's just so impactful because of it.
Yeah, it really, really is. I like that even though this movie has a Best Actor winner and a Best Actress winner, we very much stay within Clarice's point of view the entire movie. Very rarely breaks away from that. And I think that's what's important. If you're training in the FBI, you're going to hear about these people and other people's opinions. And not for nothing, the first time you see Hannibal, you've had this buildup and he's standing there and he's very calm. He's just staring at you. And it's like, what's so terrifying about this guy? But we're scared because of the buildup to him. That's what makes that opening shot of Hannibal Lecter so terrifying, is just because of the buildup that we've heard about to him. Not because of anything he's doing, because we've heard this is a crazy person. And that whole conversation goes very, very well until the epic line of, a census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Yeah.
Up until that moment, you're like, this guy's not that bad. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh shit. Okay. This guy is out of his mind. And that just really sets in motion everything else. And I also love the Buffalo Bill thing and the first intro to Buffalo Bill with American Girl playing and him staring at her through the night vision goggles. And it's great. And this movie. I wanted to say this movie is incredibly, Ted Talley wrote the script. This movie follows the exact 3-act structure that you would want to follow to make a perfect movie. 30-minute mark is when you meet Buffalo Bill. Like all of these acts at an hour and a half, that's when she runs into Buffalo Bill. At the hour, and I think or maybe the hour and a half is when Anthony Hopkins kills whoever it is. But I was pausing at each point. This movie follows that 3-act structure of like 30, hour, 30 perfectly. It comes in at, I think, an hour and 59 minutes. Like it is just the most perfectly paced movie. So I wanted to throw that in there because I think that's always something that's interesting when you're looking at it from a screenplay perspective or something like that. A movie that is supposed to be structured. These are movies that are supposed to be structured like that, a horror movie, a mystery, a thriller, whatever it is. And this one just nails exactly every point. When Buffalo Bill's introduced, when Anthony Hopkins kills whoever, you pause it, you're at a half-hour mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't notice that particularly because I don't tend to look at to see how far into a movie I am at that, but that doesn't surprise me because it does feel like a perfectly paced movie. There's never a time in this movie where you feel something's dragging or something's rushing. It just moves perfectly along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
We both had it. Both have it in our top 100. Silence of the Lambs. There it is. Anybody was wondering. Done. We're done. Halfway through, John. That's official. We're now officially halfway through.
Yeah.
Officially halfway through. We've talked about 50 movies each. We are moving on next week to our top 50, which we're going to be starting off. John has 7 from 1995. I have A Single Man from 2009. We're getting into the top half now. Don't worry, everybody. Only 2 more weeks until Shakespeare in Love. I know a lot of you have been counting that down. I'm going to roll through. I'm going to roll through my 60 through 51 just to get it out there, and I'll say, the actual movies that were in my list, not the ones that we watched. It was The Impossible at 60, Fargo at 59, Mulholland Drive at 58, Waves at 57, Sunset Boulevard at 56, Last Picture Show 55, Parasite at 54, Almost Famous 53, Social Network 52, and A Clockwork Orange at 51. 4 of those movies we did not get to talk about because John just keeps putting them all higher than me, and I filled those in with with movies like Long Goodbye, Inland Empire, Rules of the Game, Last Days of Disco, Drive. This was a heavy 10 for me, where I didn't really get to talk about my main movies. John, you talked about all 10 of your movies, so what'd you have?
I had number 60 was The Grand Budapest Hotel. 59 was Call Me by Your Name. 58, Donnie Darko. 57 was Cabin in the Woods. 56 was Goldfinger. 55 was Fantasia. 54 was The Last Jedi. 53 was Parasite. 52 was Hero. And 51 was The Silence of the Lambs.
So there you
one
go.
One of my most varied groupings of 10.
Yeah, I would agree. Yours was very varied. Mine was actually very heavy on this was probably my most heavy on like noir and misery.
Mm-hmm.
This was definitely my most heavy on noir and misery because I have a lot of that. So you were getting a little out there. I was just going for, hey, a disaster movie about people who are dying because of a tidal wave, and then a murder mystery, and then a murder mystery, and then a person who just deteriorates for an hour, and then a murder mystery, and then a town deteriorating for 2 hours, and then a kind of murder mystery. It's Almost Famous doesn't belong. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, 7 from John, 1995. A Single Man from me, 2009. I had 7 all the way back somewhere in the 80s. So both of us have 7. So we're starting to get through now some of the movies that we both had. So this will be fun, and hope you enjoyed listening to both of that. And again, we'll bring this in at the end. If you're still here and you missed the opening for some reason, we're going to be doing 1 episode per each Best Picture winner for our patrons. So patreon.com/Survivor Specialist. It's for the Survivor one. But John and I are going to be talking about it once the Oscar nominations actually come out. So that'll be fun. Yeah. And put it behind a paywall. That's what all the cool kids are doing. So that's what we're going to do too. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you again.